Chapter 29. 3 Amazing Visits. Lena gave up on trying to persuade Mrs. Murdo to move to the hotel. Since they'd all have their own houses sooner or later, they might as well stay at the doctor's house until then. Besides, Mrs. Murdo was so intent on learning to be assistant doctor that it seemed unkind to take her away. Lena and Maddie took on the job of harvesting and preserving the produce from the doctor's vegetable garden. Every morning they picked baskets of tomatoes and beans and peppers and corn and squash. Every afternoon they sliced tomatoes and laid them in the sun to dry. They took dried beans out of their pods and put them in jars. They cooked peppers and packed them in olive oil. They tied bunches of herbs with string and hung them up to dry. Poppy puttered around their feet, helping by sprinkling dry leaves here and there, or banging spoons on pots. Even Torin, whose feet were healing, often chose to hang around with Lena and Maddie. He said he knew how to make a garlic braid, so they gave him a basket of garlic, and he made one. One afternoon, as she and Maddie were cutting green beans for dinner, Lena heard wheels crunching on the road outside. The next moment she heard the whuffling of an ox, and then Torin sprang up and limped as fast as he could to the front of the house. "Uh-oh," thought Lena. "Is it who I think it is?" It was. There was Casper's battered truck, and there was Casper just climbing out of it. He looked grubby. His mustache drooped. Torin ran toward him, crying, "Casper! Casper!" And Casper smiled in a tired way. "Hey, brother," he said. He thumped Torin's back a couple of times. Then he started toward the house. Lena and Maddie went out to meet him. When he saw them, he stopped and glared. "Deserters," he said. But he didn't seem to have the energy to berate them further. He trudged into the house and plunked down on the couch. Torin plunked down beside him. "I've been waiting and waiting for you," Torin said. "Why didn't you come back with them?" He flicked his hand toward Lena and Maddie. "I had important work to do," said Casper, "which they didn't want to help with." "And what happened with your work?" asked Maddie, standing by the door. "Did you find what you wanted to find?" Casper didn't even look at her. He closed his eyes and slumped against the back of the couch. "My numbers," he said, "need readjusting. They were completely right, except for one thing." "What thing was that?" asked Maddie. "Wrong city," said Casper, still without opening his eyes. "I have reworked the numbers. Tomorrow I head north." Maddie and Lena exchanged a look. Casper turned his head toward Maddie and squinted at her. "I don't suppose you want to come," he said. "No, thank you," said Maddie. "I plan to stay here, where something with real potential is beginning." Torin tugged on Casper's arm. "Did you bring me something this time?" he asked. Casper opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a while. "Well, yes," he said. "I did." "What?" shrieked Torin. "What is it? Can I have it now?" "It's out in the truck," said Casper. "I found a whole crate of them. Very unusual. You can have one." "One what? Let's go get it!" Torin darted to the door. Casper heaved himself up, and they went outside. Lena watched as Casper rooted around in one of his crates. He came up with something she recognized with a start. She hadn't seen one for a long time. It was like something that belonged to an old friend, now dead. "What is it?" said Torin. "A light bulb," said Casper. "I found a case of 48 of them, all unused." "But what does it do?" Torin asked, peering into the light bulb as if he expected to see something alive in there. He tapped the glass with his fingernail. "It gives light," said Casper, "if you have electricity." "But we don't have electricity." "That's right," Casper said wearily. "So you hold on to it, in case someday we do." Torrin went to the window seat and sat there, turning the bulb around and around in his hands. Lena watched him, thinking about Ember. People had figured it out once, she thought. They could figure it out again. A few days after Casper left, there was another visitor to the doctor's house. Lena was out in the courtyard at the same time, cracking walnuts with a rock. She saw someone approaching the gate, a bent figure walking slowly and somehow crookedly. She stood up. The person seemed to be having trouble with the gate latch, so she went to help. And that was when she realized it was Ben Barlow. His injured arm was bandaged and strapped to his side, and the jacket he wore was draped over it with the sleeve hanging empty. That was why he looked lopsided. "Good afternoon," said Ben. "I wonder if Torrin is here."
"He is," said Lena. "I'll get him."
She found Torrin out in back of the house, sitting under a tree, eating a hunk of bread.
"Your uncle has come to see you," she said.
Torrin stared at her.
"My uncle?"
He sounded both excited and scared. He jumped up, shoving the bread into his pocket. When Ben saw Torrin coming toward him, he frowned. Then, as if catching himself, he changed his expression to a smile. "Hello, nephew," he said. "How are you getting on?" Torrin looked wary. "Fine," he said. "Good," said Ben. He stroked his beard. Lena wondered if that was all he had to say. Torrin filled the silence.
"Is your arm still attached to you?"
he said. "Yes," said Ben. "Just barely." He started to frown into the air again, and then thought better of it. He sat down on a bench. "Well," he said, "I thought I'd just come and see you. Haven't seen you for a while."
"Years," said
Torrin. "Well, yes. Busy life, you know. Being a town leader. Many decisions to make. Matters of right and wrong to grapple with."
"Oh,"
said Torrin. Lena could tell he was thinking the same thing she was. Why has he come? "Sometimes one makes the right decision," said Ben. "Sometimes not."
"I guess so," said Torrin.
Ben readjusted his bandaged arm. Lena saw that his beard was not as neatly trimmed as usual. Probably he had a hard time doing it with his left hand. She was pretty sure Ben didn't have a wife. She'd never heard mention of one. "Well," said Ben, "you were fortunate, weren't you? Getting pulled out of that tree."
"Yes," said Torrin.
"I am forced to acknowledge," said Ben, "that it was my fault. That fire."
"I guess so," said Torrin.
"An accident," said Ben, "but one that did not have to happen."
"Uh-huh,"
said Torrin. Ben got to his feet with painful slowness. "So," he said, "enjoyable talking with you. No doubt we should get to know each other. You must come by for a visit sometime, though of course I'm rarely home."
"You're very busy," said Torrin.
"That's right," said Ben. He made his way toward the gate with his limping step. As he went out, he waved over his shoulder with his good hand, but he didn't turn around. Slowly, he started back toward the village.
"That was an apology,"
Lena said to Torrin when Ben was gone.
"He's sorry for doing what he did. I guess he's sorry for not being a good uncle, too. For not taking you to live with him."
"Live with him?" said Torrin. He made a horrible face.
"Well, I thought you weren't happy living with Dr. Hester,"
Lena said.
"You never seem very happy."
"I am too happy," said Torrin crossly. He sat down at the bench that Ben had just left and pulled the hunk of bread from his pocket. A few little birds were hopping nearby. Absently, Torrin tossed them some crumbs. He seemed to be thinking.
"I like it here,"
he said to Lena, and he looked up at her with his eyes all round, as if he had only just discovered this himself. The next day, Doone came to the door of the doctor's house carrying a sack. Kenny was with him, standing slightly behind Doone and peering curiously past him into the room.
"I have to show you this," Doone said to Lena. "I made it with the present you brought me." "He's kind of a genius," Kenny said. "He already showed me."
Doone set the sack on the window seat. It was only just after dinner time, but the days were shorter now, and the sun was nearly down. Dr. Hester had already lit 2 candles. She and Mrs. Murdo and Mattie were sitting at the table shelling lima beans. Poppy was sitting with them, tearing the bean pods into little pieces. All 4 came over to see what Doone had brought. Torrin came too. He was actually more interested in showing Doone what he had than in seeing what was in the sack.
"I got a present from Casper," he said.
"Great," said Doone, but he wasn't really listening. Lena could see how excited he was about whatever he had in the sack. His eyes shone in the candlelight, and his hands fidgeted impatiently with the string around the sack's neck. When he got it untied, he reached into the sack and brought out a small device made of wood and metal. Some sort of machine, Lena thought. It had a coil of wire, and inside the coil she saw the magnet she'd given Doone. There was a handle that looked as if it would make something turn. Lena, not being much interested in machines, was a little disappointed. It was clear that Torrin was disappointed too.
"Want to see my present from Casper?" he said.
"In a minute," said Doone. "Let me show you this first."
"What does it do?"
Lena asked. "Is it some kind of can opener?" asked Mrs. Murdo.
"Or maybe it's a sort of mixer?"
said the doctor. "Or a drill?" said Mattie. "Nope," said Doone happily, and Kenny, his face shining with the shared secret, whispered, "Nope," too. "You won't believe it," Doone went on, "but it makes electricity. I found the directions for it in a book called Science Projects, but I couldn't try it out before because I didn't have a magnet. I didn't even know what a magnet was. But then you brought me one, Lena. And just the other day, I remembered about this project." He took the machine over to the table and set it down. "What you do is, you turn this crank, and that turns the magnet, and that generates the electricity, and runs it down these wires. It's supposed to be enough to light a light bulb. The trouble is, I can't test it, because I couldn't find any light bulbs that weren't broken." Torrin started jumping up and down. He pounded on Doone's arm. "My present from Casper! My present from Casper!" he yelled. He bolted into the medicine room. "What's the matter with—" said Doone, but Lena broke in. "Doone," she said, "his present from Casper was a light bulb, unused." Torrin came out of the medicine room, carrying the light bulb encased in both hands, walking now, fast but with stiff legs, being extremely careful. "You won't break it, will you?" he said to Doone. "Your experiment won't blow it up, will it?" Doone gazed at the light bulb as if it was the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. Gingerly, he reached for it. "I'll be very, very careful," he said. "You can help me, Torrin. Hold the light bulb right here." He showed Torrin where to put the bulb, and he wound 2 loose wires around its metal end. "Now," he said, "blow out the candles." Lena blew them out. The room went dark. Doone began turning the crank of his machine. At first, nothing happened except that the magnet turned around. Doone cranked faster and faster, and a glimmer appeared in the light bulb. First a glimmer, and then a glow, and then the bulb shone with a faint but steady white light. Lena shrieked. Poppy shrieked too, because Lena had, and both the doctor and Mrs. Murdo gasped and broke into applause. Kenny beamed, glancing between the light bulb and Doone's face. Torrin was being too careful to make a noise, but his eyes grew wide and his mouth dropped open. For almost 3 minutes, until his hand got tired, Dune turned the crank of his machine around and around. The doctor wagged her head in wonder. Mrs. Murdo turned her face away to hide her tears, and Torin held on tight to the light bulb even though it was getting very warm. Lena gazed at the light shining on everyone's faces. Full to the brim with hope and love and joy, she watched the little light bulb shining like a promise in the night.